Hello. The discipline of history appeals to me because I'm a naturally curious person. Why do people behave the way they do? That's the main question historians seek to answer. In 2009, I started reading about a mid-19th century group in the United States who opposed immigrants, known as the Native Americans. That's a bit confusing because they were as white as they come. The ends in this 1854 Native American Party campaign flag were flipped to mimic Russian typescript as a sort of playful spin on the concept that Europeans were beginning to influence American culture. This group seemed to think that immigrants posed a danger to the relatively new American Republic. I'm a curious person, so naturally I asked, why? That question sent me down a rabbit hole from which I have not yet ascended. It was like a train wreck. I couldn't look away. The claims these nativists made seemed outrageous. So nativist was the moniker they received because they promoted the political ascendancy of those born on or native to American soil over and against those born outside the United States. I started with Samuel Morse's book titled Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. A must-read for all those interested in the subject. In the book, Morse elaborated on an Austrian Roman Catholic plot to send Jesuit incendiaries to the US in civilian clothes, build up arsenals in the basements of Catholic cathedrals, and recruit Germans and Irish Catholic children for an impending insurrection against the US government. Soon, I was deep into anti-Catholic conspiratorial literature, including Lyman Beecher's Plea for the West and Maria Monk's Awful Disclosures, the latter of which includes a story about a former nun who claimed all sorts of awful things about the goings-on in a convent in Montreal, including but not limited to priests sleeping with nuns and forcing them to murder their progeny in a pit below the convent. The New York legislature, by the way, even sent a special investigative committee to the convent on the taxpayers' dime. They didn't find anything. As the dates of those books indicate, this so-called nativist movement really began to take off in the mid-1830s, precisely as immigration from Europe dramatically increased. Americans witnessed unprecedented arrivals from Germany and Ireland, especially in the decades to follow. And the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant vitriol reached ever higher levels of intensity. Nativist parties seeking to deny immigrants citizenship formed around the country, including in the Antebellum West, a region much less covered in the available scholarship. Nativists believed foreigners were corrupting American institutions, including churches, schools, and local government, so they acted. Just to sample their agenda, let me read a bit from an American newspaper. The Native Americans were in favor of, for example, foreigners having a residence in the country of 21 years before being allowed to vote, and opposed to papal aggression and Roman Catholicism, foreigners holding office, nunneries, and the Jesuits. Here I plan to introduce some of the topics and arguments in my book. Next, I will tell you how the current political environment has influenced the reception of my book. Also, I will explain how the Foley Fellowship helped me conclude my project. So my book provides significant contextual factors that gave rise to this story Americans began telling themselves in the mid-1830s that their country and their way of life was under attack from outside forces. Relatively sudden changes, including rapid westward development, unexpected levels of immigration from Europe, the ensuing growth of the Roman Catholic Church in America, the market revolution, the burgeoning of American cities and the corresponding increase in cases of crime and poverty, and all the turbulence of antebellum politics formed the background of this American nativist movement. The book focuses on how nativists presented intensely ideological solutions to a host of political and social problems. Their belief was that Americans should rule America. American customs should reign supreme, so that a preponderance of citizens would preserve American liberal principles. Of course, they had to define what they meant by American. Who did and did not belong? For them, American meant Protestant, Christian, born on American soil, and loyal to the United States Constitution, among other things. European immigrants in their minds did not qualify. Many of them were religious traditionalists, Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans. They were raised outside the country and were suspected of disloyalty to the United States Constitution. With their definitions in order, the nativists set about attempting to promote the political power of American values and diminish the influence of foreigners. This is how they believed they would save the young republic from corruption and collapse. The book's main contribution to the available scholarly literature derives from its special attention to region and religion. The settlement of the North American interior during the mid-19th century fueled American nativism. As Americans and Europeans alike migrated westward and populated cities like Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis, nativists described the American West as a battleground between Americanism and foreignism that they had to win to safeguard the future of American liberty. Many of the sources in the book were written by residents of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. In focusing on this region, I learned that the nativist movement and its political rise with the American Party in the mid-1850s was not merely a fringe movement of quacks. It was not just a smokescreen for other political agendas. Americans did not join nativist parties merely as a matter of political expediency. At the core of nativism was a search for American identity in the midst of rapid territorial and demographic change. The rise of anti-Catholicism, this is the religion part in America, corresponded directly to the upswing in immigration from Europe. At the beginning of the 19th century, one might argue that Americans were even more open and progressive than their counterparts in, like, say, England. Because the US Constitution allowed the free exercise of religion and made an official state religion impossible, however. Americans felt especially vulnerable once immigrants of varying religious persuasions arrived in ever-increasing numbers. There were hardly any restrictions on immigration. At the time of the American Revolution, there were only 30,000 Catholics in English North America. By 1860, 3 million Catholics resided in the United States. So from 30,000 to 3 million. And most of the growth of the Catholic Church was due to immigration from Europe. The founding generation didn't expect this to happen. American nativists panicked that Catholics and immigrants would not assimilate quickly. American civic culture would wane and the American experiment come to an end. Anti-Catholicism in 19th century America manifested in different ways that attested to the ideas and institutions that Americans uniquely value. This illustration appears in Samuel Smith's The Flight of Popery from Rome to the West, first published in 1836. Illustrations such as this were quite common in nativist books like Smith's. Here, Smith's horrific conspiracy theory is illustrated as the Pope and a train of minions fly across the Atlantic Ocean from the Vatican in Rome toward the Mississippi Valley. Pope Gregory XVI is depicted at the front of this flying train wearing his mitre. An eagle served as a frequent symbol of liberty in early 19th century American literature. That the Pope is mounted on one signaled the corruption of liberty. Behind the Pope were several tonsured clerics, one who is malevolently wielding a sword. Notice the devil perched behind the Pope. Chained to the cross at the front are nuns. The image suggests they have been cloistered against their will. Behind the chained nuns are flames, which are meant to remind viewers of the burnings of heretics during the so-called Inquisitions. So one of the insights I gathered from focusing on the West was that native-born Americans conflated immigrants, Germans, Irish, and Catholics all together into one large Catholicized, is a word they use, Catholicized, foreign, and thus dangerous group. In chapter 2, titled Culture War, I talk about how nativists targeted Protestant German immigrants because the Germans wanted to read Luther's translation of the Bible in public schools rather than the King James Version, and to enjoy recreational activities on Sundays despite local Sunday closing laws. As the U.S. was a democracy where immigrants could become citizens, Americans worried in particular about the emergence of Catholic and immigrant voting blocs, what they called foreign influence in American elections. Small-scale rioting constituted a frequent feature of American cities during the Antebellum period, before cities raised enough taxes for a commanding professional police force. When riots erupted, the police were usually ineffective, so the mayor typically called on militia groups to restore order. But the anti-immigrant riots of the 1850s really got out of hand. A new secretive order of Native Americans labeled the Know-Nothing Order because when reporters asked suspected members if they belonged, they responded, "I know nothing." Exasperated pre-existing tensions, especially in urban areas. My book includes never-before-seen in print details on events that took place inside these Masonic-like Know-Nothing councils. In the election of 1856, the Know-Nothing Party's presidential candidate received 22% of the popular vote, making the Know-Nothing Party the second largest third party in American history. I also closely studied these highlighted events. Not only were they unusually bloody, but the so-called Know-Nothing riots between 1852 and 1858 disrupted democratic procedures. Riots in Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis erupted on election day as nativists, inflamed by largely false reports that immigrants were voting illegally, targeted German and Irish citizens waiting in lines at the voting stations, and upon meeting resistance, proceeded to physically expel them from voting stations. During a gubernatorial election in St. Louis in August 1854, rioters overtook significant portions of the city, burned Irish businesses, defied militia groups, and killed over 10 people. The mayor of the city desperately deputized hundreds of citizens and finally restored order after 3 days of unrest. During an election in Louisville in 1856, rioters destroyed German and Irish businesses and killed over 20 people. The riots disrupted one of the most hallowed democratic American institutions, the vote. the physical violence propelled many urban areas into a crisis. The consequences of this first American nativist movement were profound. First of all, as I've already alluded to, this started a pattern of political behavior that exists to this day. While the targets of nativist animists have changed from like Germans and Irish to Southern Eastern Europeans, Asians, or Latin Americans over time, much of the rhetoric has remained the same. Secondly, it's important to realize that the nativist movement did not happen in a vacuum. The nativists were influenced by the dialogue with their opponents. Chapter 6 of the book presents a rather subtle argument. It's no wonder historians have overlooked it, given their focus on the Northeast, where nativists didn't really have to pacify Germans or Irish to achieve political victory. But in the West, in states like Ohio and Missouri, know-nothings were forced to form political alliances with Germans and Irish to win elections. In so doing, they advocated the removal of explicitly anti-Catholic language. They even changed the requirements for membership in the Know-Nothing Order so that people of European ancestry could join. They opposed Catholicism, not Catholics, foreignism, not foreigners. They made a basic demand: pledge your oath to protect religious freedom for all. And that's enough for you to count as American. In other words, nativists, especially in the West, shifted from explicit anti-Catholicism to a commitment to the founding principle of church-state separation. As observers of the past, we find ourselves then in this strange position of acknowledging the role of the nativist movement in transforming American political culture into a more inclusive domain, welcoming otherwise suspect religions as long as its adherents pledged to support church-state separation. Okay, there you are. I just summarized 183 pages of text in 20 minutes. Part 2. Save your clapping. Part 2. Given all of this, I think there are lessons we can apply to more recent circumstances. And I think historians can offer informed suggestions about what is likely to occur when the old rally cry of nativism sounds anew. I believe studying history generally, and American nativism in particular, promotes an otherwise elusive virtue: wisdom, or the ability to know that which we should fear. Here's where I'll discuss the political environment in which my book was finally published. I settled on a topic and completed the vast majority of my research by 2014, when Barack Obama was president, and at a time when if someone suggested to you that reality TV personality Donald Trump would be the next president, you would have laughed at the absurdity of it. I noticed a pattern after the election of 2016. Countless interactions with students, faculty, publishers, peer reviewers, and the public at large gave me an indication of how people might perceive my book. I listened, and I learned that Trump supporters did not see themselves as bigots. As such, they would not be willing to connect their movement to the nativist movements of yesteryear. Or, in some more extreme cases, my interlocutors suggested that maybe the nativists of the past had a point. In speaking with anti-Trump people, many of them my colleagues, I learned that they indeed viewed Trumpism as a form of nativism. and were not particularly interested in exploring the nuances of nativist claims about immigrants, national security, or other alleged threats to American culture. Whatever side they were on, Trump was on the minds of everyone, every time I mentioned my topic. My book just came out, and the initial signs have somewhat confirmed my hunch. In my first book, Interview with H. Civil War, in February 2021, I received this question, asking me to connect antebellum nativism to the insurrection at the Capitol. This is a very small data set, admittedly. But here are some quotes from the first two scholars to review my book. So the first one there made a mention of the MAGA hordes of the Trump years, and the other one mentioned President Trump. Again, encouraging this connection between antebellum nativism and Trumpism. I mean, after reading these reviews, it would almost seem as though I wrote this book as a reaction to Trump populism, wouldn't it? But I didn't. I designed the project and conducted the vast majority of my research at the time of my graduation from St. Louis University in 2014. I received a revise and resubmit from Fordham University Press in 2015 and began working on substantial revisions. Over the last 5 years, it has been all the rage, let me tell you, for scholars to connect their academic subjects to Trumpism. Every scholar can expect at least one question about Trump. I was, and indeed still am, quite ambivalent about all of that. As a historian, I am acutely aware that political figures come and go, trends appear in scholarship and fade away, and the world keeps spinning. The purported goal of historicism is to uncover fundamental truths about human behavior, patterns, causes, connections. What's really going on beneath the surface? But I couldn't help myself, could I? I was working on revisions in 2016 when my editor at Fordham University encouraged me to write an epilogue connecting my findings to the election of 2016. So I started working on that. I was only 2 years into my first college professor job at Troy University in Alabama with a book under production, 31 years old, young and dumb. If you get a hold of my book, you'll see that Trump takes up a significant portion of my epilogue. Then I was invited to deliver a TEDx talk where I first shared content from my epilogue. It's still on YouTube if you want something to listen to on your drive home. In my epilogue and the TEDx talk, I attempted to connect what I had learned about American nativism to the current political milieu, and to do so in a fair and balanced way without alienating people on either side of the political aisle. After all, I am friends with people of all political persuasions. I regularly deal with students who hold a diversity of views. And I am an historian. So I believe that historical methods are what differentiate accurate scholarship from full-blown political bias and propaganda. Like, if it weren't for these historical methods, then history writing might as well be politics. This is what I tell my students, by the way, when I teach research and methodology. Historians follow rules. They must. The degree to which they are unsuccessful is precisely the degree to which they don't follow the rules. After my TEDx talk, I met some people in the crowd, and the first person to speak with me was a Pakistani Muslim woman who thanked me for explaining certain connections to the past. The very next lauder was a red-headed Southern son who likewise thanked me for presenting a perspective on Trumpism that he had not yet considered. I counted this as a success. Like a Pakistani woman and a white Southern man both approved my message, boom. Over the ensuing years, however, these wonderful people I met at the conference began to seem more like outliers. I couldn't help but notice that very few agreed with my premise that historians should remain balanced and evidence-based in their discussions on politically salient topics. Pro-Trumpers lambasted my speech for failing to take into account a list of complaints they had about immigration. Anti-Trumpers loathed my suggestion in the TEDx talk, which is this: the outcome of new nativism will likely mirror that of previous nativist movements. Despite the distasteful fear-mongering, the most likely outcome is that Muslims will become tolerated in America's public spaces because of this country's robust tradition of religious freedom. Hearing this, pro-Trumpers pin me as a quintessential Marxist academic. Anti-Trumpers accuse me of irresponsibly fueling white supremacy. It became clear to me than ever that the current political environment will inevitably affect the reception of my work. I didn't like that. I don't like that, however inevitable it may be. So, I decided to put myself to the test. I planned an experiment that would allow me to apply historical methods fairly and accurately to a question for which I genuinely did not know the answer. And forget Trump, I was done talking about him. This is where the Foley Fellowship entered my career. The Friends of the Missouri State Archives afforded me the opportunity to execute my research design, which was this, and I don't think I said any of this in the proposal, but this was my research design. Nativists claimed that immigrants from Europe contributed to rampant crime in American cities. That claim can be tested, I realized. The Missouri Archives houses the criminal court records, mayoral reports, police arrest records, and various censuses which provide raw data on the relationship between between immigrants and crime in St. Louis City. I had no idea going in what I would find. I decided up front that I would report whatever the data showed. If immigrants did not commit crimes at a higher rate than their American-born counterparts, then that might be evidence that the nativists were full of it. If immigrants, on the other hand, did commit crimes at a higher rate, then I would carefully analyze that further. My findings are the subject of Chapter 5, which passed peer review twice, by the way, because it is now published in the Journal of American Ethnic History. Chapter 5 has become my most innovative and controversial chapter, apparently. The two reviewers who I cited above, the ones who mentioned Trump, both took issue with Chapter 5. One called it weak, writing, quote, "He uses copious statistical data to show poverty and high crime rates in immigrant communities, and has become something of a slog." The other Trump-mentioning reviewer writes, "Where Ritter diverges from recent scholarship is in his emphasis on immigrant crime and poverty and their role in stoking anti-immigrant sentiment. Despite providing 20 tables of data on the subject, Ritter's reasoning on the role of immigrant criminality and the rise of know-nothingism is not especially persuasive." Interestingly, the one and only reviewer who does not mention Trump, not even once, is quite positive about Chapter 5. Chapter 5 strikes this reviewer as the best yet. Its first section explains how economic resentment, declines in disposable income, and daily uncertainty fed nativist activity. Ritter employs statistics on crime and poverty very tellingly here. He shows percentages of immigrants among the incarcerated and poverty-stricken, and he breaks down by ethnicity the fatalities in the cholera years of the late 1840s. All told, this is an excellent employment of social demographic statistics. Okay, so which is it? Is this chapter an unpersuasive, weak slog, or an excellent employment of social demographic statistics? Another thing, to what extent does the political bias of my reviewers play a role in their review of my analysis? Let me very briefly outline my findings in chapter 5 before I conclude and give you a chance to respond to some of the questions and comments I've raised so far. All right, so to define my terms just briefly, nativism is basically promoting the interests of natives as a priority over non-natives or foreign-born people. I use a term in the chapter, real disposable income, which just refers to income after taxes. And then I also study these major anti-immigrant riots. So I argue that there is a relationship between the rise of political nativism, changes in real disposable income related to immigration, and the anti-immigrant riots of the 1850s. Nativists claimed during this time period that immigration caused negative economic effects. Based on my research, the data suggests that immigrants indeed were charged with more crimes and exhausted more urban resources on average than native-born Americans. Here's an example of one of those pesky, non-persuasive charts two of my reviewers groaned over. Non-Native Americans were disproportionately represented in prisons. Zooming in on St. Louis tells a similar, if not more striking, story. Here's the percentage of foreign-born inmates in the St. Louis workhouse. Here's the nativity of inmates at the St. Louis workhouse. Frankly, I was shocked to discover this, and I immediately had to know why. I found that city ordinances targeted the petty misdemeanors of vagrancy, drunkenness, and prostitution, and that mayors frequently directed police officers to round up vagrants, drunks, and prostitutes in perceived problem areas. European immigrants were disproportionately poor, and thus prone to what some have called crimes of poverty. The policing of impoverished immigrant communities in urban areas exhausted a disproportionate amount of taxes and rendered certain areas of the city dangerous. There is an underlying economic story here. Economic hardships in relation to real disposable income probably contributed to the rise of political nativism in urban areas in the mid-1850s. The argument I present in my book is not that European countries produce more criminals. Immigrant populations in the early United States did not represent a perfect cross-section of their home societies. Migrant groups included higher rates of poor adult men. Poor adults, and especially poor adult men, commit more crime than children and women. The point is that the immigrant population in the US, while weirdly skewed, did account for a substantial, probably disproportionately high amount of the total petty crime and poverty plaguing antebellum cities. Americans resented this problem for economic and cultural reasons. Economically, they had to pay for numerous urban programs and policing. They worried about their property values. Culturally, they were already nervous about outsiders, but I think the magnitude of immigrant-related crime and poverty in urban America likely contributed to the tremendous rise of political nativism and the riots in the 1850s. So that is an historical interpretation, not a political statement about Trumpism. And while it made me nervous to countenance, even briefly, nativist claims about immigrants in the past, what I discovered, I think, could be tremendously useful and important. Not only did I discover that immigrants from Europe were committing more crimes on average than their American counterparts, but I figured out why immigrants were in prisons at a higher rate. It's because city administrations targeted certain poverty-related crimes. Is this not exactly what history is supposed to do? Is it not supposed to lead us to the underlying causes that prefigure our everyday experiences? Maybe historians will begin to think about how underlying economic factors may have contributed to the rise in anti-Islamicism and anti-immigrant sentiment during the election of 2016. I don't know. That's a project for someone else. I hope that my research does not serve a certain side of today's political aisle, but rather brings us all closer to truth. Thank you.